Goeienaand, dit is maandag aand die 19de Februarie en dit is weer verskriklik warm hier in Appington. Dit is op die oomblik 41 grade, dit was 41 grade 5 uur vanmiddag. So dankie tog vir verkoeling en waaiers wat 'n groot verskil maak. Goed, kom ons gaan aan met Destiny. Barro de Quanza, Angola. The Lada Jeep reduced speed as it was nearing the huge overhead concrete pillars of the bridge that spanned the Quanza River. 200 meters before the military checkpoint guarding the tremendous suspension bridge, the Lada left the air-spalt road and followed a dirt track in an easterly direction. Timothy Shikongo watched the large pivots next to the road as he drove, saw the multitude of workers busy in the fields of the Cuban military farm, producing enormous amounts of fresh vegetables needed for their troops. To his right was the green line of huge indigenous trees that lined the river. One of Angola's largest river, the Quanza River, was navigable up to the town of Dondu, 125 kilometers upstream. Deep and wide and fast-flowing, the water ran into the Atlantic Ocean a bare 5 kilometers to the west between endless stretches of sandy white beaches. A few locals resided in the area since the start of the war. Not that it was anywhere near or close to the battlefields, but because of all the military training facilities along the banks of the river. Situated 5 kilometers upstream from the bridge is the Quanza base, home to over 800 SWAPO trainees, some exiled politicians, and the detention barracks where the SWAPO descendants were kept in isolation. The base could be seen as a strategic and operational command center from where the planned fighters were sent to the forward bases along the front, from where they could infiltrate and engage the Boers. Mamba drove slowly along the twin-track dirt road leading up to the base on the riverbank, watching the trainees with mild interest. The Quanza base existed out of 4 areas: the housing complex with its small but comfortable air-conditioned houses for the senior personnel and their families, the administration area, the training area, and the detention or rehabilitation center. And that was where his South African prisoner was kept, or at least that's where she slept at night. During the day, she worked in the hospital under close supervision. An armed guard was always somewhere close, keeping a close watch. He had flown with his prisoner from Lubango, reveling in the praise he had received from the SWAPO High Command. His prisoner stayed in the Central Prison for Women in Luanda until the International Press Conference, whereafter she was transferred to Quanza Base. At his instance, it was decided, or rather at his insistence, it was decided that she should work in the hospital by day, and they were always in need of medical doctors, and then locked away by night in what is considered as fairly good accommodation, normally reserved for descendant politicians until the High Command decided her fate. If they could not be rehabilitated, they were moved to the dungeons, and from there no one ever emerged into normal life again. And for a brief moment, Mamba thought of Alfonso. And then there was Gina. A few months ago, she had arrived at Quanza Base as the hospital's only doctor. Mamba entered through the Quanza Base's gates and parked the Lada in front of the hospital. From inside came a loud shriek. The front door slammed open and out she came. Mamba stared at her in wonder. He had almost forgotten how lovely she was. Gina Maldonado stood there smiling, her long brown hair gathered in a ponytail, a stethoscope around her neck, and then she was in his arms. He held her close, the months of separation falling away, his heart warm with the love he felt. He kissed away the tears that were rolling down her cheeks. whispering endearments. She was a good 10 centimeters shorter than him, and as he looked over her head, he saw his prisoner standing in the door of the hospital. Lieutenant Leslie Ann Roberts, prisoner of war, appeared shocked. She stared disbelievingly at the scene in front of her. She remembered how excited Gina was, how she had bubbled at the opportunity to see her man again after so many months. The forced friendship between the two female doctors, their opposite ideologies of capitalism and communism, forgotten in the mutual duty of saving lives, allowed them to confide in each other. The infectious excitement of Dr. Gina Maldonado, and now the shock. Gina's man was her captor. 1,000 miles to the southeast, a lone Dakota DC-4 was flying north at treetop level and crossed the Angola border just 40 miles west of Rundu. It was a civilian aircraft, and there was only one pilot in the cockpit of the heavily loaded plane. Andre Comfort smiled at his passenger in the co-pilot's seat. Another 20 minutes. I have arranged for Spiker to be at the landing strip. We must be quick. While they offload the duck, you must talk to him. 30 minutes on the ground max. We must be airborne again before it's dark. So while they offload the DAK of dan nou duck. The plane had left Eros Airport in Windhoek just before 10 in the morning. Its flight plan stipulated around a trip to Maun in Botswana and back. They had landed on a dirt strip somewhere east of Chunkwe, where they refueled from a couple of 220-liter drums. Left there by a cooperative farmer who just happened to be the officer commanding of the Grootfontein Commando. There they waited out the rest of the day in the shade of a large camelthorn tree and resumed their flight north just after 1700 hours. Andre Comfort was a resourceful man, a pharmacist, a pilot, and a shrewd businessman who worked with a plan. He was the sole supplier of all pharmaceuticals and medical equipment to the rebel group of Savimbi. He wasn't unknown to the authorities or the South African Defence Force. In fact, he was working very closely with military intelligence. For that reason, the airspace to the west of Rundu was cleared of all aircraft, and the Dakota could cross the border without being noticed. Tom McLaughlin was hugely surprised when he arrived at Eros Airport, where Andre was leaning against the tail of the Dakota, waiting for him. "You must be Tom," he said, "and I'm Jerry." And upon seeing Tom's expression, he started laughing. "Only kidding. I'm Andre, and I will be hitting the skies to Spiker this morning." Spiker, code name for Dr. Jonas Savimbi, leader of the rebel group UNITA, and the man that Tom needed to see. Andre banked the plane to the right, lining it up with the dirt landing strip, and for Tom it felt as if the wingtip was sweeping through the branches of the trees. Then the Dakota was level, drifting down, and hit the surface with a light bump. Andre throttled back, applied full brakes, pushed the throttle slightly back, and Tom was riding against the harness as the speed bled away. The tail dropped, and Andre stuck his head through the portside window as they taxied towards the waiting trucks and reception party at the end of the runway. Andre Comfort opened the rear door, slipping the steps into position, and stood back. "There is Spiker waiting for you. I'll be offloading as usual. You have 30 minutes. "Thanks," Tom muttered and climbed down the few steps. He recognized the impressive figure of Dr. Jonas Savimbi to the side with one of his aides next to him, watching him approach with apprehension. Tom was not in uniform. Instead, he wore a two-piece khaki overall and John Deere cap on his head. Still, he lifted his right hand to the tip of his cap in a salute to the famous rebel leader. "It is an honor to meet you, Doctor." He extended his right hand, and the huge hand of Savimbi enveloped his own. "Welcome, Tango Mike. I have heard about you, and I am extremely grateful that you have saved the life of my cousin here." And to his stunned surprise, Tom recognized the soldier at Savimbi's side. It was the UNITA he had helped in the kraal of Roberto a couple of months earlier. He held his hand. "And how is the head?" The young soldier grinned at him, his teeth white in the late afternoon light. "Call me Johnny, and my head is just fine. Come," Savimbi gestured to a table under the tree. "Please have a seat. Whiskey?" And without waiting for an answer, he poured a liberal dram into each of the 3 glasses. They sat down, and Savimbi lifted his glass in recognition towards Tom. "Now, Tango Mike," he said, "how can I help you?" The red ball of sun disappeared between the western horizon, or rather behind the western horizon. "It will be dark soon," and they talked. Chapter 9. Windhoek 8 months later. Prisoner exchange. In bold black letters. Brigadier Harrison Pote sipped his tea, glancing past the cup at the headlines of the Windhoek Advertiser. The South African government announced during a press release late yesterday afternoon that an exchange of prisoners might be happening soon, and that everything possible was being done to get Lieutenant Leslie Ann Roberts back to her country. This followed a large public outcry after the abduction of Lieutenant Roberts, a medical officer stationed at Oshikati. During a special session of Parliament, the opposition had grilled the Minister of Defence, who was quick to point out that the government held a trump card in one of the senior SWAPO generals. General Bomba was captured during the airborne assault on SWAPO training base of Kassinga. Harrison Pote replaced the cup carefully on the saucer. Then he folded the newspaper and placed it aside, and felt under the desktop for the key. He found it stuck to a lump of plastic. He used the key to spring a secret drawer from within another drawer and lifted a thick file to the desktop. He stared at it thoughtfully. The file was thick, excessively so, and was kept together with a red ribbon, similar to the one in the vault at military intelligence offices in Windhoek, but quite thinner, with only a few bare facts of the subject. General Verskoning Bomba. Harrison had reported back to his reporters in Pretoria that the SWAPO prisoner was a hard nut to crack, that he refused cooperation, and that he had even withstood the feared waterboarding techniques. He was clearly a fanatic who was willing to die for his case. Pretoria, though, had showed little interest in the most celebrated prisoner of Cape Kanagap, and Harrison was relieved because Comrade General Bomba had talked, and the more he talked, the more Harrison had listened with growing anticipation. Soon it became a fantasy, then an obsession, and Harrison had seen the road ahead clearly and well defined. His personal route to unfathomable wealth, his ticket out of here, his passport to retirement. Harrison had only allowed one other interrogator to visit Bomba, his aide and confidante, a fellow Rhodesian, Lieutenant Jeremy Cogg. And between them, they had worked it all out. They had carefully decided upon a plan, which they related to the anxious general in captivity. An agreement was reached. Information gained from the general flowed through his second confidante, Major Connolly, who discreetly passed it on to a certain Catholic priest, who somehow always succeeded in getting the messages through. And so far the plan had worked, actually better than he could ever hope. The fact that the prisoner was a woman, a medical doctor, was something he could not foresee. But the upheaval was beyond expectation because the South African population wanted her back as soon as possible. Public demand was in his favor. But for his plans to succeed, it was important that the exchange of General Boma and Lieutenant Roberts continued unhindered. And that was exactly where his senses warned him that things could go wrong. He hadn't heard from his henchmen in Ondangwa for quite a while. Major Connolly and Fort Fire, the recce base at Ondangwa, was his eyes and ears in case any possible rescue mission was to be launched. And so far, there was nothing, not since the initial effort had failed. He glanced at the clock on the wall. It was well after midnight and time for bed. He carefully placed the file in the secret drawer, closed it, and roused his huge body from the seat. Harrison was overweight, and he knew it, but his enemies knew well not to underestimate him. After years in the Rhodesian Armed Forces, he had quietly left the Byzantine country in the last days before independence, and the South Africans were only too happy to welcome a man with his expertise into the military. His reputation as an unusually skilled interrogator had landed him a good position in military intelligence, where he had climbed the ladder of success. Now, at the age of 55, he had reached his professional ceiling. He knew he had reached the highest possible position as a foreigner, and he could still kill as fast and easy as one can blink an eye. His reputation was well earned. Harrison Pote woke as usual at 6 o'clock in the morning and swung his feet to the floor of his two-bedroom house, where he had been staying since the death of his wife 3 years previously. The shower was refreshing, he thought, as he ran a comb through his bushy red hair. A snip with his special scissors, and he grunted satisfied as he stared at the equally red moustache and winked an eye. "You handsome rich bastard," he mused. "Well, almost." In his comfortable cell, Comrade General Bomba had an early start. The coffee, orders from the brigadier, was promptly delivered to his door at 5:30 in the morning. The news he had received the previous day was still sending shivers of excitement down his spine. His freedom was imminent. He was drawing a map. His part of the agreement. He would give half of it to the brigadier today, the remainder when he boarded the plane to freedom. Kassinga, Southern Angola, 4th of July, 1978, 6 o'clock in the morning. Comrade General Bomba did not sleep well. He was worried. The task on his shoulders was huge. The reason why he was sent to the dunghole of the training camp to personally supervise the safe passage of war treasure back to Luanda. War treasure which a contingent of plan fighters stumbled upon by pure accident. A bare 2 weeks before his arrival, one of SWAPO's special units had intercepted a UNITA patrol. After the short but brutal contact that left 4 of the UNITA bandits dead, they found several ammunition boxes filled with diamonds. Diamonds from the Kafunfo area and obviously destined for the South African military. A down payment on the huge war debt owed to the South Africans. The diamonds, with millions of dollars, were brought to the SWAPO camp at Kassinga, and the honor was bestowed on Comrade General Bomba to ensure its safe arrival at their headquarters in Luanda. Rumors of this vast fortune had spread like a wildfire through the camp. General Bomba knew only too well the dangers of this. From mutiny, theft and open revolt, he had quickly realized the importance of getting into safety as soon as humanly possible. For that very reason, he had commandeered the most reliable Lada jeep to transport the diamonds to the makeshift runway at Dongu, 80 kilometers to the north. It was his intention to depart as soon as it was light enough to see. His instructions were clear. Not even the Cubans and Angolans were allowed to know about it. This was SWAPO's property alone, and therefore he secured the help of only 2 staunch members of the special units. He didn't want to draw attention to his departure nor to the purpose of his mission, and no one would be wiser as to the whereabouts of the diamonds. The cargo has been loaded and secured, Comrade General, reported the sergeant from the entrance to the bunker. We are ready to depart as soon as the Lada is refueled. I thought the refueling was done last night, the general voiced his dissatisfaction. The depot is without fuel, Comrade General. We had to collect diesel from the various power generators. The sergeant sounded apologetic, but we had secured enough gas oil. The cans will arrive any moment now. Please make it snappy, the general retorted. We have to leave soon. We cannot afford to miss the plane to Luanda. Ever since his arrival at Kassinga, Comrade General Bomba had heard the reports of various overflights of South African reconnaissance planes, and involuntarily he glanced up at the sky. The clear morning air was reassuring, yet he could not get rid of the unease that had kept him awake for most of the night. Bomba lit another cigarette. The strong Cuban tobacco buried his lungs, but he hardly noticed as he swung into the passenger seat of the Lada. The sergeant had finished the refueling and climbed stiffly into the driver's seat with the second member of the special unit scrambling up to the rear and sat down on top of the ammo cases filled with the Kofonfu diamonds. At exactly 8 o'clock they drove off, much to Bomba's annoyance because they were 1 hour late. As they cleared the gates of the base, he glanced at his wristwatch. It was just past 8 o'clock in the morning, and the world exploded. The shockwave hit them just as the Canberra bomber swept past, then another and another. Still fed, he stared back at the dense clouds of smoke that shot into the sky where the SWAPO soldiers were, and mass on the parade ground. Go! He shouted, horrified, and the sergeant pushed down on the accelerator with such force that the third inhabitant of the Lada lost his footing and tumbled to the dirt road. But they kept going. Major Wes Tomlinson banged his Walker Siddeley Buccaneer on his left wing, saw the dust and smoke in the distance where the fragmentation bouncing bombs of the Canberras had hit their target and leveled out. We are slightly offline, came the voice of his navigator. 1 degree to starboard. And Wes Tomlinson corrected his flight path with a touch of the rubber, his eyes jumping from instruments to target and backs. Bombs away! He swore softly, realizing he had overreacted. His load was off target, and he swore again. The leading buccaneer shot over the SWAPO base of Kassinga, and as Wes pulled the control stick against his stomach, he saw the rear view mirror, the 1,000 limb bombs exploding just to the north of the base. But even in his disappointment, he noticed with very satisfaction the fast-moving vehicle crashed into the cloud of the explosion. The shock of the 1,000-limb bomb hit the Lada with intense force and it veered left and overturned, skidding across the earth into a tree with a jarring thud. Corporal Jimmy van der Merwe stood in the door, the icy wind of the early morning against his cheeks, his heart thumping with controlled fear. He was barely aware of his left hand on the door frame, his right protectively over his emergency parachute, his left boot on the edge of the door, the right firmly behind it. Oh my, this is it, he thought, the moment of truth, the dream of fear and every paratrooper worldwide. He saw the bushes and trees flashing by horribly fast, at just 600 feet below the Hercules C-130. He knew he was in the 4th C-130 and he vaguely noticed the Transil C-160 that was following behind. Somewhere on the starboard side would be another one, 6 transporters in total, 367 paratroopers, the largest airborne assault since the Korean War. The hand slapped his shoulder and Jimmy stepped into the open sky. The fear was gone. Adrenaline flooded his veins as he instinctively glanced up at his deploying parachute, felt the tug as it opened, and he swung in beneath the brown canopy, vaguely aware of the sound of gunfire as the ZPU 14.5mm multi-barreled anti-aircraft guns started firing at the dangling paratroopers. Jimmy screamed at his stick of men, trying to draw their attention, to focus them, to edge as close as possible to himself. It is essential to land as closely together as circumstances allowed, so that they can be ready to do battle and not losing precious time searching for one another. His feet hit the ground and he went into a natural roll, a sudden feeling of relief that they were still alive. He hit the quick release on his harness, discarding his parachute. All around him, his men railed, R1 assault rifles ready. He was satisfied that his stick had landed safely. To the south, he could hear increased small arms fire. The battle had started. His men fanned out on his sides and Jimmy led them at a run towards the assembly point of Platoon 11. The large baobab tree was easily identifiable and he realized that they were the first at the rendezvous. He stopped, went down on one knee and gave the signal to clear the area to the flanks before continuing to the tree. A burst of AK fire erupted directly in front of him, and Jimmy went down, firing as he did. He saw the SWAPO terrorist being thrown back by the heavy 7.62mm round. There was no more firing. As he approached, Jimmy saw the second fire on the ground, the hands folded above the head, and recognized the bank insignia on the epaulets. It was a SWAPO general. He had just taken the first prisoner of the battle for Kassinga. It was Comrade General Bomba. To the south of the intensity of the battle was increasing. Soon Jimmy and his men were involved in heavy fighting, facing the ZPU anti-aircraft guns in a ground roll, while from the southern town of Teclamutete, an armed column of the Cubans was rushing to the aid of the SWAPO combatants. This time, Major Wes Tomlinson and his squadron of buccaneers made no mistake. Even after their ammunition was gone, Wes kept on buzzing the convoy, endlessly, frustrating and delaying them. It was late afternoon before the paratroopers claimed victory. They lost only 4 men. A final rocket, struck by 2 Mirage 3s, halted and the already defeated Cubans. The last of the paratroopers could depart safely. Boma was one of the few prisoners evacuated along with the paratroopers. Corporal Jimmy van der Merwe never saw his captive again. Dit is dan dit vir vanaand. Ek lees môre aand verder aan Destiny. Dankie dat jy like, subscribe en share en die belbutton druk. Jy is altyd welkom om die boeke by my te bestel by my e-posadres soos wat ek dit gee onder aan die video's. Dankie, mooi aand.